Are they prejudiced, these millions who love the racing game and the men who play it? Are they prejudiced, or are these really the most wonderful, crazy, and colorful characters in all of sport?
And man, when they throw the flag, I'm going down the backstretch doing the race. Here's a monkey sitting in the passenger side, and you know it's real close because the driver's sitting in the other cars. Here's a monkey grinning at them, and they'd almost run into the wall. And would you believe that monkey would laugh at them and cut up and wave at them? He run in 8 races with me, and NASCAR didn't say a word. And all the people in the grandstand, you know, that loved animals, they had to come down and see Jocko Flocko in the pits.
For half a century now, NASCAR has been abundantly blessed with multi-dimensional stars such as Tim Flock, who once won 18 races in a single season. Behind the wheel, they are fascinating and lovable personalities. The combination is called charisma, the ability to touch the fan at the emotional level, to win hearts as well as races.
I won the Daytona 500! I won the Daytona 500!
More than just race drivers, these are men who have transcended the sport, delivering it to new levels of notoriety and widespread adoration. Reigning over them all, of course, was the King. In the history of athletics, each generation has had room for only 1 or 2 superstars, as rivals Wilt Stilt and Bill Russell defined a great era in the history of basketball. But what if Michael Jordan had been their contemporary? So too does each racing generation offer up its finest talent for the consideration of history, but only a few men face that judgment with accomplishments and influence. And why do these few stand out from the many who ran fast, won races, and took their shot at immortality? Consider the car owner. These two are powerful personalities, pivotal figures in the history of NASCAR. They are as fiercely competitive as the heroes behind the wheel. If wheel-to-wheel competition is NASCAR's bread and butter, then this abundance of transcendent personalities are its seasoning and its spice. And this 50th anniversary celebration becomes an all-you-can-eat buffet of competitive spirit and colorful characters.
I had an idea, you know, you get so dry throat and everything and that dust and all, and I thought that'd be a hell of a treat if you could have a thermos jug. We used to have one behind our seat with a douche bottle bag tube that would go up, and we had a nipple on it, and we'd get a drink every once in a while during the race, you know, and I filled mine full of beer, and I thought that'd be the treat. The damn thing looked like a washing machine after making about 10 laps.
Today's Winston Cup stars race in the fishbowl of modern media. Life is a whirlwind of autographs, appearances, appointments. The heroes tend to be family men and role models.
The sport is lucky. It really doesn't have any, I hate to use a baseball analogy, but Albert Bell does not drive race cars. And people that follow sports know what I mean by that.
In contrast, some of NASCAR's most colorful characters are rendered in the stark black and white of racing's early history. Pioneer heroes are shrouded in the mists of their time, their stories hard to tell. Details are missing, buried by the rooster tail of a new sport that was in a big hurry. Facts have been improved upon, polished with the cloth of selective memory until they become tall tales.
That's like this Schindler guy that drove an Indy car with us, and he turned it over in Darlington, and he had a damn wooden leg, and it flew out on the racetrack, and a woman walked by and said, "Ah!" You know, about to faint, and they had a damn wind sticker on it about that big around, on where his knee went.
NASCAR folklore is filled with swashbuckling daredevils and motorized free spirits who raced all day, partied all night, and still made it to work on Monday. One man with a strong work ethic, a man that established the most famous last name in all of racing, was Lee Petty. Petty competed in 427 races over 15 years, winning 54 times. His most famous battle was with Johnny Beauchamp in the 1959 Daytona 500. Ironically, the 1961 Daytona 500 qualifying race produced a duel with that duo again, this time cutting Petty's career short when both drivers cleared the Turn 4 wall. Amazingly, both survived, but Petty only raced 6 more times on short tracks before he hung up his helmet. Two other superstars of the era were Buck Baker and Herb Thomas.
In the backstretch, Thomas and Baker are flying. This is Baker's chance, and going into the third corner, he slips past, taking first. Here's the winner, rolling to his pit. Baker's from Charlotte, North Carolina. Mighty glad he spent the afternoon across the state line at Darlington. He's grimy and dog-tired.
Baker won out over Thomas on that 1953 day in Darlington, but Herb Thomas ended up with 48 career wins to Baker's 46. The best winning percentage in NASCAR history is held in the Flock name. Tim Flock, the youngest of racing flocks, established a record that is unequaled even today.
I run in 189 Grand National races for NASCAR, and I won 40. And that's where I got that 21.6, I believe, percentage, which is still the record today, and I'm really proud of that.
Think of all the ways NASCAR racing has changed in 50 years. Primitive tracks in which the pioneers raced have given way to space-age speed palaces. Yet the essence of the sport has not changed. It's about competition. Pass the car in front of you, drive to the edge of control, and if you slip off that edge, crashing into the abyss beyond, be brave enough to deal with the consequences. It is inescapable truth. Racing is dangerous. At the end of the day, the characters in this sport loom larger than life because they are brave enough to stare down death. Ultimately, that courage is what separates them from the rest of us.
Let's meet some of the men who are going to make the sports news. Let's look at the drivers. Here's Fireball Roberts, a quiet, slow-spoken fella from Florida who is the most famous stock car driver in all the world. He's the favorite. He had the top qualifying speed of over 130 miles an hour. He really moves. This is Joe Weatherly. 40 years old, he's a veteran from Norfolk, Virginia. Kind of the jokester on the tour. Everybody likes him, but he's never done too well here at Darlington. Not yet, anyway. This is David Pearson, 27 years old, one of the younger drivers. And moving into the picture, Larry Frank.
Fireball Roberts was in his prime, the biggest name in a game called NASCAR, a souped-up Southern racing series in America had just begun to discover through the magic of television. Flat-topped and soft-spoken, the hard-driving Roberts was the embodiment of that sport, right down to that perfect nickname, Fireball, which had nothing to do with driving race cars.
Glenn grew up in Apopka, which is inland Florida, and it was organized baseball, and he was a pitcher for a team in the next little town, and it was the Selwood Mud Hens. And one day someone said, when he pitched a ball, they said that was really a fireball. And it stuck.
Fireball's nickname didn't catch Doris right off the bat, but she met Fireball at a track in Charlotte on Little Rock Road, and her heart was captured by his mind.
Not only by then was I impressed with his driving, but later in the evening, I was very impressed with his intelligence.
Each crop of NASCAR heroes leaves its distinctive mark.
There goes Roberts. He's got him.
Roberts led his generation into uncharted realms of speed, not only on the track, but with his quick-thinking mind as well.
We have here a phenomenon that exists at no other track in the country, that of the wind turbulence. You drivers call it drafting. Can you tell us a little bit about the technique of drafting and how you handle it?
Well, first off, if people could imagine the draft of one of these cars like the wake of a boat, maybe they could understand it a little better. And that's exactly what happens out here. We have a wake of air that you can't see, but it's just like a boat in the water. So if the front car breaks the wind for the car in the rear can run faster on less horsepower.
Stature in the sport, respect from peers, God-given ability, and courage, none of it guaranteed the star drivers immunity from danger. In the 1964 running of the World 600, Junior Johnson and Ned Jarrett tangled and Fireball spun trying to miss them. His car hit the inside wall and erupted in flames. 39 days later, the burns he suffered claimed his life.
Our cars landed about 30 feet apart. And so I ran over to see if I could help him, and he was in the process of coming out of the car. He said, "Oh my God, Ned, help me, I'm on fire." And by the time we got part of the uniform off, the safety people had gotten there, and so they took over from there, but the burns eventually, of course, took his life.
He was just sort of my idol. And then when he got killed in the crash, it's just like, I guess when you're a little kid, you find out there's no Santa Claus. It just sort of took everything out of the race. It just changed my whole theory of auto racing.
I was good friends with Fireball. We had a lot in common. We talked a lot about racing, and we raced together a lot. And he's a guy you could race with and trust, and you didn't have to worry about what he was going to do. He'd do what was right. It wouldn't be something he'd do something foolish or something like that.
Roberts had 33 wins in his 14-year career. Unfortunately, the death of the sport's biggest star was not an isolated incident. Little Joe Weatherly first claimed the racing spotlight as a motorcycle champion. He came to NASCAR with a wide-open style and a huge sense of humor. The Virginia native claimed the national title in 1962 and 1963, but 4 months later, he was cut down in his championship prime in a crash at Riverside. Those who die in battle are often remembered best for their courage. Tiny Lund, a victim of a fatal 1975 crash at Talladega, is this sport's best example. He was one of NASCAR's most popular stars, though his only big win was the 1963 Daytona 500. 2 weeks before that win, he left the famous fish camp he ran in Cross, South Carolina, and headed for Daytona with 18 cents in his pocket and no ride. He was a spectator inside turn 4 when Marvin Panch was going for a speed run.
I had the car qualified for the Wood Brothers, and Ford put a Winston Cup or Grand National type engine into a Maserati, birdcage Maserati, and they wanted some dummy to try it out because they were going to try to break the record. And it felt pretty good going through 1 and 2, so I got on down the back stretch, and before I got into the third turn, the thing airborne. We didn't have spoilers. It airborne, came down on its side and over on its top, and I skidded around over by the tunnel. And that baby caught on fire.
There is nothing like being in the right place at the right time, both for Marvin's sake and for the fate of Tiny's racing career.
And here's Tiny Lund, the fellow who got this ride for his heroic efforts is pulling Marvin Panch out of his burning sports car, was named to drive the car as Panch is being recovering. Tiny Lund doing a great job at car number 21. Waiting for his service. He's the leader. He inherited the lead when Lorenzen and Jarrett stopped, and he's trying to hang on to it now with the pit stop, getting close to the half-minute mark, and away he goes.
Tiny's is a wonderful story of courage rewarded, but the deaths of his contemporaries, Roberts and Weatherly among them, had a profound impact on the sport and its stars. The 60s could be remembered for early retirements. It's almost become cliche, repeated after each big crash. Winston Cup stock cars are touted for their ability to withstand horrendous impact. Tough NASCAR standards for car construction are lauded as an example for the entire racing world. Time after time, the drivers walk away. But it wasn't always like that.
Speed had outrun safety, and it was a very, very upsetting time to be in racing. And you saw a lot of early retirements.
Ned Jarrett was an eager youngster who did it right. He paid his dues in the sportsman's ranks, learned his craft, earned the right to move up. And by the time he graduated to NASCAR's big league, he had a reputation. Good driver, family man, solid, reliable. He's a good guy. Ned knew there was more to racing than standing on the gas and sawing at the wheel. After winning the Grand National Championship, he took a Dale Carnegie course, making him a better spokesman for the sport. On and off the track, Ned left his mark. He won 50 races, 2 championships, and the Southern 500 by 14 laps, a record that will surely stand forever. He helped extinguish the flames that claimed his friend Fireball's life. And then, a year later, he got a phone call from the Ford factory asking him to withdraw his entry in the next night's race. It was a rude awakening to factory versus NASCAR politics.
I got to thinking after that, hey, do I not have any more security than that? One phone call in a pay phone booth can ruin my career, just pull the rug totally out from under me. And then I began to think about, well, maybe I need to look for something else to do.
And that something else to do was broadcasting the sport he loved. And 30 years after hanging up his helmet, he is the essence of the racing experience on television for fans Sunday after Sunday. Ned's biggest rival was Junior Johnson, the salt-of-the-earth character America would come to know as a stereotypical Southern stock car racer. Everything in that stereotype was true. Junior really was the moonshine-hauling mountain boy who raced the devil down the Carolina back roads. And sometimes on Sunday he would go over to the North Wilkesboro dirt track where the locals raced their liquor haulers after the NASCAR boys chased their checkered flag. And along the way he caught the eye of famed author Tom Wolfe and became the last American hero.
There's no question about somebody putting a mark on you like that it don't impress you now. It will. It'll impress the dickens out of you. Especially when he went on to, put it in a book and stuff of that nature. I got more out of it than he did.
Junior was a symbol of racing's roots and one of its early stars, but his most amazing feats came as an owner. Each fall at budget time, this homespun hero would venture out from Ingle Hollow to the boardrooms of corporate America, returning with millions of dollars to fund his race team. With its ongoing lineup of all-star drivers, that team was among the most respected and successful in the sport. Junior retired from driving with 50 wins and went on to win 6 championships as an owner. No one could boogie like the Golden Boy. In the early 60s, Johnson, Jarrett, and the rest of the Carolina boys encountered a formidable opponent, unlike any they had dealt with before. Fred Lorenzen came south from Chicago with 2 USAC stock car titles in his pocket, determined to beat the NASCAR regulars. The Golden Boy was different. It's not just that he was a Yankee who wore a jacket to dinner, carried a comb in his pocket, thought it was just as good to think your way to victory as it was to stomp the throttle and bull your way to the front. As if all that weren't enough, Freddie was a sex symbol to boot.
And here's 27-year-old Bobby Sox idol Fred Lorenzen of Elmhurst, Illinois. 2-time national champion and master of the acknowledged technique of drafting here, the standard bearer of the Ford team.
Success came quickly. Holman and Moody gave Freddie the fastest Fords on the track. He won the big races, made the big money. And then abruptly he quit. Most racers reflecting on their careers are quick to say they have no regrets. Fred Lorenzen is the exception.
All of a sudden, I just woke up one day and just quit. I wasn't feeling good. Now I regret it to this day. I made too quick of a decision at 33 years old. I think it was the worst mistake of my career, but something just got to me, and I just did it. And I really hate it. I hate to even talk about it anymore. I was on the prime of my career. I don't know why.
Consider this. Ned Jarrett and Junior Johnson retired on the same day, October 30th, 1966, after the big late-season race at Rockingham. Fred Lorenzen followed suit a half-year later. So in the space of 6 months, 3 of the sport's biggest stars hung up their helmets. But into the ensuing vacuum rushed 2 men destined to rank among the sport's biggest stars. Just as Valentino begat Bogart, who begat Nicholson, as Babe's lore passed to Williams, who in turn passed the torch to Mantle, so too does a superstar status pass down in the history of NASCAR. With the pioneers now in retirement and legends leaving the sport early, a void needed to be filled. Enter Bobby Allison and David Pearson. As Lorenzen abruptly left the driving scene, Ford asked him to stay as a team manager. He handpicked a successor in the Holman Moody Ford. Bobby Allison got the ride just in time for the '67 race at Rockingham. He won his first time in the car.
I wasn't too nuts about being a manager. I thought I'd like it better, but I didn't. Allison I did because he was sharp in the chassis, and I feel a driver that's got real sharp in the chassis is half the battle. I mean, they got to be able to set the car up good. He knew how to drive, and he also knew how to set a chassis up, so that gives you a 100% edge on everybody else.
I think of the 1967 American 500 at Rockingham, my first 500-miler, my first ride in the Holman and Moody Ford. To win that race, Ralph Moody helping me like he did, and of course Fred Lorenzen as the crew chief, a guy that had won a lot as the driver, now was the crew chief. And of course Ralph Moody was the one that guided the program.
Legend had it that there were Holman drivers and Moody drivers, but few men could serve both masters. Allison was the proof. He won 3 of his first 4 starts for that famous team and was promptly fired. He was a Moody guy. Holman didn't like him. And into that vacant seat stepped David Pearson, himself a free agent thanks to a clash of personalities. He and owner Cotton Owens had won the 1966 championship, but the following year had a falling out over who was going to ride with whom to a race in South Carolina. Cotton got mad, David got mad, words were exchanged, and thus David joined Holman and Moody at a most fortuitous time. They had decided for the first time to run all the races to chase the championship. Pearson was the man for the job. He won back-to-back titles in 1968 and '69.
David Pearson could not stand losing. The only driver today that compares in ferocity at the wheel with David Pearson is Dale Earnhardt. I mean, David Pearson was a tremendously aggressive and assertive driver.
David's tour in Car 17 produced 31 wins and 2 championships. That run ended on a couple familiar notes. A phone call from Ford and a fight with a boss. Ford was pulling out, so Holman's solution was a salary adjustment.
He said he wanted to cut my salary from 50% to 40%. And I said, John, if that 10% is going to make you go broke, we might as well quit right now because I don't think that's going to make any difference, you know. So I left him.
Believe it or not, Pearson's replacement was Bobby Allison, still a winner and still only able to get along with half of Holman and Moody. For David Pearson, unemployment didn't last long. A phone call from the famed Wood brothers, he was back in business.
Leonard, I don't know, he's a master of racing. You know, he would have the car ready, and we hardly ever had to change that thing. And if we did, we would sit down and talk about it before we ever changed it.
To this day, they are legendary owners, the pride of Stewart, Virginia, loved by every throttle stomper who ever climbed through the window of the famed number 21. In the 60s, Glenn and Leonard went up north for a month, and came back with a secret.
They had been called to Indianapolis in 1965 to be the pit crew for Team Lotus, which was a Ford-backed entity. Jim Clark won the race, and they were in the pits. And during their stay in Indianapolis, they learned about stagger. Nobody knew what stagger was except the IndyCar set, the difference in circumference of one wheel alongside another wheel. And they figured that out, and they were the only team in NASCAR racing that used stagger, and they used it to their advantage.
They was probably the first person to ever measure a tire, to get the stagger right and everything. Nobody else ever done that. And I know for over a year, nobody ever even saw us do it.
One thing that definitely is no secret is the success that Pearson enjoyed saddled up in that Purolator Mercury, rewarding him with the current title of NASCAR's second winningest driver. And for Allison, he ranks third on the win list along with Darrell Waltrip. It's a Southern thing. Stock car fans identifying their heroes by first name only. In the 60s, Richard reigned supreme. From the Holman Moody soap opera, David and Bobby emerged as stars, and rounding out the triumvirate of challengers to the king was Cale. Fullback, stocky, and bulldog tough, Cale Yarborough was in the midst of a 5-year love affair.
I sat in that seat with the Wood brothers for 5 years, and one of the best 5 years of my life. Everything really got to rolling with the Wood brothers and just set my career on fire.
Mark those words. Coming from the man who would later win 3 straight championships driving for Junior Johnson, that is an eloquent tribute to Glenn and Leonard Wood, and the esteem in which they are held by the men who drive their cars.
I didn't really have any problems at all figuring out who to give the good tire deals to. It was either Cale, Richard, or David. Between the 3 of them, when I started in the mid-70s, they won everything. And Cale, Cale was just a wonderful driver, and what a great guy. You could not help but admire and love Cale. He'd take on anybody, any day.
Fried chicken-fueled Junior Johnson Chevys with Cale Yarborough at the wheel dominated NASCAR's late 70s. With championships in 1976, 77, and 78, they temporarily dethroned the king himself, but NASCAR's established stars were growing old. Yarborough, for example, craved the luxury of a reduced schedule. The year is 1975. The Bee Gees' Jive Talkin' is at the top of the charts, and the most famous talker in the history of sports is winning the Thrilla in Manila. And a brash young challenger with his own habit of running his mouth breaks into the NASCAR scene with 2 victories.
He came into this sport wide open.
And they're really tucked in behind that 40 car there.
That's DK Ulrich. He doesn't get out of the way, and we've got cars spinning all over the track. Both leaders are out of it.
I like Cale a lot. He doesn't tell the truth all the ways, some of the wrecks he caused me to have, but nevertheless, I like him pretty good.
I think he realized after I started calling him Jaws, maybe he shouldn't talk so much and slow down a little bit.
Waltrip did run hard, both with his foot and with his mouth, and in 1979 made a run at greatness, challenging Petty for the Winston Cup, only to see his team and his title hopes fall apart in a pressure-packed championship stretch run. Darrell yearned for a better break that would make his racing dreams come true.
Cale came to me in May of '80 and said, I'm gonna give you some good advice. Probably the best advice anybody had ever given me, certainly up to that point. He said, I'm gonna get out of that 11 car, and Junior would do anything to get you.
And now, sensing an ability to finally back up his words, Darrell saw his future success riding on buying out his contract with his current team.
Finally, we come to terms with DiGard that we'd give him $300,000. We met with him on Monday morning here in Charlotte to give him the $300,000. Typical DiGard, they walk in and say, whoa, wait a minute, that's not enough. Now, wait a minute, that was our deal. We agreed on that. How can you back out now? Well, we want $25,000 more. Why? Well, because you're in the Busch Clash. We forgot about that. And you'll probably win it. And we want half of it because you got in it because of our car. So I had to run out and scramble around and get $25,000 more on top of the $300 I'd already given them. But anyway, we were able to do it, got a release, got out of there, signed up with Junior, and the rest is history. And I did win the Busch Clash.
He was the first to buy out his contract amid such public fanfare, first to enthusiastically pursue a role of corporate spokesman and media darling. Waltrip redefined what it meant to be a NASCAR star. In the process, he underwent a transformation from the mouthy interloper the fans loved to hate to the 1989 winner of Winston Cup's most popular driver award. But DW's era as the sports dominant driver diminished when he left Junior Johnson. Darrell saw his future in the burgeoning sponsor-friendly racing organization of a Charlotte Chevrolet dealer named Rick Hendrick. Junior, meanwhile, took a look in his crystal ball and made a run at the sport's next superstar. Those who saw him race still marvel at his determination and drive, his greatness. But how many of today's fans even recognize him? He made his mark on the hard scrabble short tracks, not the super speedways that became showcases of the stars. No legendary team provided cars. He built his own in the garage out back with help from his kids. And one of those kids was the key to the father's place in history. Inspired by near reverence for his dad, Dale Earnhardt would become the greatest driver of his era, maybe of all time. His bad boy reputation was a big hit in blue-collar America. He enjoyed popularity never before experienced by a racer. And on that foundation, he built a business empire the likes of which the sport had never seen. For over a decade, his was the face of stock car racing in America. En route to that mind-blowing success, he never forgot where he came from. And thanks to Dale Earnhardt, the sport will never forget his father, Ralph.
He would race on Thursday night in Columbus, South Carolina, and I would get up early Friday morning, and I'd go out, and the car would be on the trailer outside, and he'd came in probably 3 or 4 in the morning, and I'd go out early, and before I'd go to school, and I'd look the car over, I'd look around the car, and I could about tell by how much dirt was on the front or how the car looked if you had a pretty good night or you know, a bad night. And I couldn't tell whether he won or run second, but I could tell whether he's in the front. But most time in Columbia, he was either the winner or he ran second pretty close.
Young Dale wasn't very sophisticated, a far cry from the well-heeled hero who jets from track to track in his 550-mile-per-hour Lear jet. Boy, that kid could drive. It caught the eye of those who could take him where his father had never gone.
And now you can see Donnie Allison is going inside Cale Yarborough. Cale Yarborough undoubtedly in trouble. Then Neil Bonnet and you've got Dale Earnhardt there, got sideways. The back end of the car got loose. He's got it sideways again. He's trying to regain control. The car is loose. Tire temperatures have gone up. The car is less sure on the road. Dale Earnhardt gaining control there. Young, talented driver, but he nearly lost it there.
That brash display of driving was in his rookie season of '79. 1 year later, in Rod Osterland's car, in only his second Winston Cup season, Earnhardt won his first championship. It was a year after Richard Petty won his last championship. In retrospect, we can clearly see the end of one superstar era and the beginning of the next. At the time, Earnhardt's title seemed almost a fluke. Osterland left the sport shortly after winning that 1980 championship, and Earnhardt quickly slipped into the shadow of Darrell Waltrip's dominance through the early 80s. But Dale was no fluke, no flash in the pan, and Waltrip's car owner knew it.
I had went to Budweiser 3 or 4 times and tried to get them to, you know, take Earnhardt on after Darrell left. And they just, it was, I don't know why, but it's just something that they couldn't never convince ourselves that Earnhardt would be good for their product.
When Earnhardt was not afforded the opportunity with Junior, Richard Childress came calling. Richard Childress, another NASCAR racer history might well have overlooked. 285 starts and nary a win, and a driving career that stretched from 1969 to 1981. Not until he crossed the threshold from driver to owner did Childress find his niche, his key to racing immortality. Fate put Childress and Earnhardt together. The result was magic. 6 Winston Cup championships in 9 years. Even Petty at his best was not that good. But with the conquest came controversy. Dale learned the game watching Dad run the short tracks, where contact is racing reality and aggression is the key to survival. Ralph Earnhardt's kid became the intimidator. By applying those same rules on big tracks, his was the bumper most feared in the rear view mirror. Through it all, his fan base grew. Annual sales of Earnhardt's paraphernalia has exploded to nearly $50 million. However you choose to analyze his appeal, the fact is that Earnhardt himself and the sport he had come to represent had struck a chord that was resonating across the landscape of American sports. At 200 miles per hour, stock car racing was roaring into the mainstream, headed for the top, led by a guy who wasn't afraid to knock people out of the way. It's still the biggest day in NASCAR history. To celebrate America's birthday, the president went to a stock car race. Not just any race. This was the big race, Daytona. On the day that King of the Sport scored his landmark 200th victory.
With all the presidents that's ever been in the United States, this is the first one that's ever showed up at a racetrack. So everybody's got to go from that, from racing standpoint, and I wanted to be the one that was able to welcome him to Grand National Racing.
Proud to be an American could be NASCAR's motto, so it's appropriate for its stars to pal around with presidents. But King Richard Petty and the sport over which he reigns did not always travel in such prestigious company. Richard and racing grew up together from the humble beginnings in the hills of North Carolina. Like Ralph Earnhardt, Lee Petty was a great racer, whose greatest contribution to NASCAR history was his son. Richard would become the king, but his dad laid the foundation for that kingdom back in 1950.
This is something I really like to do. I feel comfortable with it. I think we can win races, and I think we can make a living out of it. So then he just stopped his trucking business and just went into racing full time.
Fiercely independent, Lee didn't drive for others. Instead, he built Petty Enterprises, at first the family team, eventually the Chrysler Corporation factory team. Independent to the end, Lee walked away from racing the day he retired. Richard's ascension began as a teenager. He and his brother Maurice took one of Lee's convertibles to a NASCAR race. And Richard's been going ever since.
I was driving, my father was driving, and then my brother wanted to start driving. So he drove, 10 or 12 races and did pretty good. And in fact, he done better to begin with than I did. But he had a wreck somewhere, I think Columbia, South Carolina, turned the car over a couple times, and he got out of it and he said, "Tell you what," he says, "you drive the car, I'll work on it."
Through the glory years, Maurice was a chief mechanic, and the factory-backed Petty Enterprises Plymouths and Dodges were the ultimate NASCAR weapons. Racing 40 or 50 times a year before the start of the so-called modern era, Richard racked up the wins, and no season for any NASCAR star can match the 1967 season for Petty Enterprises. 27 wins, 10 of them in a row, led to the crowning of the king. But for the most part, Richard and his family were held up as a symbol of the sport. Not just winners, but winners the world could be proud of.
Richard has set a standard for dealing with the public and sponsors and the media, honesty, charm, availability, And I can't think of a significant Winston Cup driver that's come into the sport in the last 25 years that hasn't watched that, noticed it, and tried to emulate it.
In 1992, after 35 years in the cockpit, Richard Petty finally closed his driving career with an epic farewell tour that ranks as one of the great fan fests in NASCAR history. He has contributed so much to this sport. So many wins, so many championships, so many memories.
When I think of a perfect race car driver, but yet spokesperson, I look at Richard Petty. He is the dynasty that we all want to be.
If our theory is correct, if there's only room on the superstar stage for one or two players at a time, if in the annals of history each generation is indeed limited to a handful of heroes, then one can only wonder what might have been. For instance, would Cale, David, and Richard have enjoyed the success that they did if Ned, Jr., and Fast Freddie had stayed in the sport? And how about shining stars Nelson Stacy and Pete Hamilton, who won at Darlington and Daytona but then walked away? And consider Leroy Yarborough, who Junior Johnson considers to be the most fearless of all his drivers. In 1969, Leroy won the equivalent of the Winston Million, taking the checkered at Daytona, Charlotte, and Darlington, but would ultimately pass away in a mental institution after battling alcoholism. But perhaps one of the greatest warriors on the track was fighting a war off the track with AIDS. He would eventually succumb to the disease in 1989. But Tim Richmond, whose 7 wins in 1986 proved his talents true, was one of the few that could test the Intimidator.
We lost a great racer like Tim Richmond. I mean, he's just so much talent driving a car, but he's also one of those guys I don't think could tell you much how to put it together. But he could drive the heck out of it if you got it right.
It is also true that fate cleared that stage in the tragic year 1993. The decade had begun with such great promise. 2 rising stars were vying for the attention of the stock car world. 2 fine young men many thought would eventually live among the old-time greats. There was Alan Kulwicki, the Wisconsin short tracker with an engineering degree to go with his heavy right foot, willing to give up everything he had for a chance to prove that he was the best, and prove that he did on his own terms.
Alan Kulwicki, talent-wise, was untouchable.
Alan got his chance, proved his point, won the championship, danced for that one moment on the superstar stage, if only briefly, before losing his life 4 months later in an aviation accident. And how do we measure the potential of Davey Allison? With his dad Bobby showing the way, and what better role model could any son have? The father leading, the son learning, the twin heritages of the Allison family and Alabama gang were surely ready to soar to new heights of greatness. Instead, the dreams all crashed down with Davey's new helicopter. Another bright light for the future gone suddenly dark.
I think Davey would have definitely been champion over several times probably. Who knows, I might not be 7-time champion if he is still alive. He'd have beat me out maybe a year or 2. It's just hard to figure how it would have turned out.
But there is always another hopeful waiting for a turn on the superstar stage. Always another brave and talented kid waiting for an audition, eager for his chance to prove just how good he can be. Kulwicki won his championship the same day the King retired, and a lot of folks saw it as a changing of the guard. We had no idea.
Was 1992, Atlanta, the final race of 1992. Richard Petty, the king of stock car racing, his last race. But guess whose first race it was that day? Jeff Gordon. The king is dead, long live the king.
The move from USAC open-wheeled cars to NASCAR stock cars when he was only 18 made all the sense in the world. This kid had learned to race hard, fast, and close. Put him in a car with fenders, there's a very good chance he'd go somewhere. and go he did. The results are everywhere. 29 wins, 2 championships, the Winston Million.
It used to get under my skin because he'd go out there and win, and I never thought he paid his dues. I thought he just got in a car, had the best cars, the best motors, the best everything, and went. But after I keep watching his talent and watching what he's able to achieve, I go, you know, this guy's naturally gifted, and he's a hell of a driver. End of story.
For years, pundits assumed the King's 200 career wins would never be equal. They still assume that. But now and then they wonder. He comes to this sport in the flower of charismatic youth at precisely the moment it has exploded into the mainstream of American consciousness. For 50 years, stock car racers toiled on the fringes of American sport. Now, at last, the product of Bill France Sr.'s vision has become the hottest sport in America. Thus does Gordon simultaneously reap the benefit of all those who have gone before and open doors for those who will follow. Where will he rank in a pantheon that centers around a king and includes so many who have contributed so much? History will decide how significant the current heroes are and how they stack up against all those who have gone before.
Continue watching for extended interviews with NASCAR legends that are included exclusively with this commemorative video.
That was probably the greatest track that I ever raced on, because I was the only driver to win 6 races, and a lot of people don't realize I won 6 races on the beach. And what I'm talking about, I won in the modified division, I won in the convertible division, and I won 2 Grand National races at Daytona. And before I get too far ahead of my story, I got paid for 4 of those races. Would you believe I got disqualified in a modified race in 1948 or 49. 132 cars showed up at Daytona. And for me to clarify this track at Daytona was 4 3/10 miles around it. You could have run 200 cars on it. But 132 cars showed up for that race in 48 or 49. And I won that race and got disqualified because I had a roll bar in the car that Bill France Sr. and the other officials said was illegal. But that was the start of the year in 1948-49 in February, and it really hurt you to win that first race and get disqualified. But Daytona, to get a little further in the story, I came back, same racetrack. In 1954, I got a phone call from Mr. Woods up in Corbin, Kentucky, and he said, "Tim, I've got 2 brand new Oldsmobiles I'm taking to Daytona. I've got a driver, one, I understand you don't have a car for the February race." And after several phone calls, I showed up at Daytona in 1954, and we qualified Mr. Woods' car, and we won the 54 race, starting off in February again like they still do today. But would you believe, after an all-night inspection, and half of the next day, Bill France called me up, and I went over to his house and with Mr. Woods, and he said, "Tim, we got to disqualify your car." And I said, "Man, you got to be kidding, you know." And it really got me. I can't say what I'd like to say on this interview, but it really upset me. But I was trying to be as nice as I could. But it made me so mad. I said, "Bill, you done disqualified my car in the modified division after winning, in 48, and now you disqualify me here in 54. I'm not going to run for NASCAR anymore, and I'm going to quit." So he said, "Well, I can't help that, but we're going to disqualify your car." $2,400, back then was like $30,000 today. So to make this story not as long as it can be, I went back to Atlanta in 1954, and the Pure Oil Company, it's called Union 76 now, but they had built a brand new filling station out on Piedmont Road in Atlanta, and they asked me would I like to, since I wasn't going to be racing, to take over and get that station started. And I jumped at the chance because I didn't have nothing else to do after quitting racing. So I run that filling station almost the whole year of 54, trying to build it up, get the customers coming in, and we'd done pretty good. But man, I was starving to death, to tell the truth. And around December of 54, a bunch of my guys had been buying gas from me and said, Tim, the race is coming up in February, and one of them had a brand new 44, and he says, there's 3 of us going to go down. We want you to come, go down and watch the race. I said, man, I'm too busy with the station. But in January, I made up my mind I would go to Daytona with them. True story. We ride down to Daytona, and we had a party, got on the beach, went down to the race course, and some of the cars that was going to be in the race were going up and down the beach. And we were standing a bunch of other people watching this, and a Chrysler 300 came by. And just, I think the man upstairs had to be on my side after the other things that happened to me in Daytona. I looked over one of my buddies, I said, you know, if I had that Chrysler 300, I believe I could win this race again this year. And standing 2 foot from me was Tommy Haygood, a Mercury outboard dealer. He still is in Orlando, Florida. He said, hey, what's your name? I said, Tim Flock. He said, you won the race here last year, didn't you? I said, yeah, I did. He said, well, do you believe I'm a Mercury outboard dealer for the man that's got that big Chrysler 300, and you don't have a driver for it this year? I said, Tommy, are you kidding? He said, would you like to meet him? So I left my 3 buddies, and Tommy put me in a little Mercury outboard truck and took me uptown to a filling station that Keycaper had rented. In about 30 minutes, he comes pulling in the station, had 6 great mechanics with white uniforms, and they was waiting on him to get back. And Tommy said, wait a minute, he's going to be busy. And we stood out in front of the station. And finally, Keycaper walked out, and Mr. Haygood said, Carl, this is Tim Flock. He won the race here last year, and I know you don't have a driver. Would you let him drive your car? And the guy, Keycaper, said, he's real hoarse and real tough. He said, what's your name? I said, Tim Flock. He said, what do you think about this car? I said, it was awful big. He said, well, get in and look at it. So I slipped in the front seat of the Chrysler 300, and I'm looking around. I said, oh, my gosh. He said, what's the matter, Flock? I said, this car is an automatic transmission. He said, what does that matter? I said, in NASCAR history, no automatic transmission has ever won a Grand National race. He said, you want to race the car? I said, yes, sir, I'll run the car. He said, what are we going to do about the transmission? I said, all I can do is when I go in the north turn and the south turn coming off the beach, I can jerk it down in low, wind it, slap out, and knock it up in drive. He said, well, let's do that. So we qualified the car on a straightaway run down the beach right at 140 miles an hour, which was wound up in high, drive. But it was a new world record at that time. So Fireball Roberts was driving for Red Vote, the mechanic I was telling you about earlier, had a brand new Century Buick with a straight stick. They throwed the flag in that race, and we go down in the north turn, and coming off the north turn, it turns into asphalt, and it's kind of uphill. Fireball caught second gear, and he pulled me about 8 or 10 cars. And at the south turn, 2 miles in front of me, I could almost catch him in that 300, finally get going. And coming off of the beach, he'd pull me 2 or 3 blocks. And would you believe we'd run that way the whole day? And I finished behind Fireball. He won the race. And the next morning, we sitting in the motel, fixing to go to the restaurant, and one of the Keycaper's mechanics come running in and said, had a headlines. Back then, you got headlines at Daytona. Tim Flock wins Daytona, Fireball Roberts disqualified. And man, you know how I felt, because I knew how Fireball had felt, because the same thing had happened to me the year before. But Keycaper, he was really happy. And we went on, and 2 months later, he had Chrysler Corporation to put a straight stick in our Chrysler 300. And in '55, after that win that Fireball got disqualified in, we won 18 Grand Nationals and the Point Championship. So it was the only time in NASCAR history, and still is, that an automatic transmission car won a Grand National race.
Probably the most unestimated driver there was out there. He was the most fearless person I ever seen. He had no fear. His talent was not even touched as far as showing what he could do. And he never got a chance to really express what he could do. I think the '69 season was an indication of just opening up his career. And then, whatever happened to Leroy from that on, I don't know. But I've never had a race driver or been around a person that had no fear of nothing and had talent was hid that you could not believe when you needed it, he'd give it to you.
I think the 1964 World 600 was one of the saddest days that NASCAR Winston Cup racing has seen, because we lost, in my opinion, what was the first superstar in the sport, Fireball Roberts. Now, he didn't lose his life that day, but it eventually took his life. It was about the 5th or 6th lap of the 600, and I was running about 5th or 6th, and Junior Johnson was trying to pass me. And we went into turn 1, he got on the inside of me, and there was a bump between turns 1 and 2 that would upset your car. And either when he hit the bump or either the air turbulence of all the cars running so close together caused him to slip just a little bit, and he bumped my car, and both of us spun. My car spun to the inside of the racetrack, hit the inside retaining wall, and when it did, it burst open the conventional gas tanks that we were using back then. As I skidded down the wall, it created sparks and it caught on fire. Well, Fireball was behind Junior and I and trying to maneuver by both of us. He probably got hit from behind and spun him, and he also spun to the inside, and he hit the inside retaining wall. He also hit me. His gas tank was burst open, and so his car erupted into flames as well. We both slid, I would say, 2/3 of the way down the backstretch at the Charlotte Motor Speedway, and there was an opening in the wall that allowed infield traffic to go in, and his car hit the end of the cement wall, and when it did, it flipped it over, and it also tore the firewall and everything out of the car. And so when it did that, the gasoline then ran inside of his car. So he landed on the roof. My car landed on the wheels. It never did turn over, and I got out of it immediately. The cockpit of my car didn't catch fire until perhaps 2 minutes after I got out of it. And so I ran over, our cars landed about 30 feet apart. And so I ran over to see if I could help him, and he was in the process of coming out of the car. I know stories were written that I went in and unbuckled him and all that kind of stuff. That is not true. He had unbuckled his seatbelt and was climbing out of the car, but he'd gotten his foot hooked on something on the top of the car, and the roll bars or something, and so I just grabbed him around the shoulders and jerked him out of the car, and he and I stood there together on the track and tried to rip off the uniform that he was wearing. Now, back in those days, there was no known fiber or fabric that you could make, flame-proof fabric that you could make a uniform from, but NASCAR had a solution, boric acid and other ingredients that you bring whatever clothing you were going to wear on race day, on Friday or Saturday, and they would dip it into this and it would flame-proof it. But Fireball was allergic to this solution, and he was a class guy. He had on a custom-made uniform, had zippers on the sleeves and zippers on the sides, and it was just a tight-fitting, you know, it was a very neat-looking uniform. Tough to get off when you needed to get it off in a hurry. And everywhere there was an opening around his neck, around the sleeves, around the legs, is where it started burning. And so we stood there and tried to rip that off of his body. And the first thing he said when I got to him, he was conscious, he was not injured in the wreck. He said, "Oh my God, Ned, help me, I'm on fire." And by the time we got part of the uniform off, the safety people had gotten there, and so they took over from there, but the burns eventually, of course, took his life about 6 weeks later. And it's unfortunate that something like that has to happen to open people's eyes to needs, but two things came out of that. One is that Firestone went to work immediately building a fuel cell. And you know, most forms of motorsports today, it's required that they have a rubberized fuel cell in them. And DuPont went to work and started trying to make a flame-proof fabric. And now there are many fabrics on the market that are flame-proof, babies' clothes and all kind of things, you know, that are flame-proof today. And another thing that came from that particular accident too was the fire system that we had, fire extinguisher system that we had in the race cars. We had basically a unit that was strapped onto the roll bar that the driver could reach. But in a case like that, I mean, you know, he needed to get out of the race car. I need to get out of my race car. Those little extinguishers would not put out the fire that was there on that given day. And so before we were allowed to go on the track at the next Super Speedway event, which was at Atlanta, Georgia, a few weeks later, Ford Motor Company would not let us take our cars on the track until we had a system that had been designed that would go off automatically in that case of that kind of fire. And so those three things came from that particular accident.